formally introduce Brad Manera, the Senior Historian of the Curator of the Anzac Memorial. Brad has been with the Memorial since 2010, and in that he's had a pivotal part to play in the development of the Memorial, in the interpretation, particularly with the centenary extension and the exhibition gallery in the centenary extension of the Anzac Memorial. He has worked in museums in West Australia, the Australian War Memorial, and he's worked extensively in public history, and he's researched and co-written a number of documentaries, most recently Whaler, the Great Australian War Horse in 2014, and The Power of 10, Anzac Victoria Crosses on Gallipoli in 2015. He's currently writing a book on 100 New South Wales battlefields entitled In That Rich Earth, due for publication next month, and in that he will formally present a copy of his new book to the RUSI New South Wales Library. And he's also co-authored New South Wales and the Great War, which is a wonderful reference book for anybody who wants to really dwell into what was the impact on war of the First World War, the Great War, on people in New South Wales, both before, during and after the war. His partner is a South African, and he has visited South Africa in recent times to look at some of the conflicts over there. And he's going to look at, in part of that, he came across an unusual Australian connection with the 140th anniversary of the disaster Isandlwana in the epic defence of Rourke's Drift. And it's not for those who saw the movie Zulu 100 times, like most of us have, that Michael Caine is not an Australian. So, with no further ado, please welcome Brad Manera.
Thanks, Paul. I'm very, very new to Africa, and so just discovering the place. So this is going to be fairly conversational. There are probably going to be many errors, but like all of us that grew up with a television in the house in the 1960s, you just could not escape that extraordinary film with Michael Caine and Stanley Baker, and so it led to a curiosity. And when I first came to the Eastern States, I found my way to the New South Wales Art Gallery and this remarkable painting. Probably the most expensive single purchase by any cultural institution in any Australian colony in the 19th century. This was the purchase of a painting called The Defence of Rourke's Drift by a French artist, Alphonse de Neuville. He based this painting on interviews with veterans, and he painted it within 10 months of the siege at Rourke's Drift. If you haven't seen it, make it a point of visiting the Art Gallery of New South Wales. It's an extraordinary work because it telescopes a 12-hour contact into a single frozen moment, and it really is. One can only imagine that the artist intended survivors to show their families what they did during that remarkable battle. And I guess I've used it as quite an inspirational work for the design of the new historic gallery at the Anzac Memorial. Because this is a photograph of yours truly standing on that site year before last, and so where so this was the north face. In the background is the rebuilt hospital site at Rourke's Drift, now a Zulu Cultural Centre. I can't remember what the next slide is. Oh, of course, the film, hurrah! And no contemplation of any battlefield is complete without looking at how that place was interpreted at the time and since. And of course, this is the way we remember the Zulu Wars. So, what do we know about South Africa in the 1870s? It's been bypassed. Once a vital route on the way to empire. But by the 1870s, the opening of the Suez Canal, the route to India is substantially shorter, and there is a real concern for that South Africa might be left on the shelf, particularly by those that are administering the colony. And there is where the story begins, because in the late 1870s we get some extraordinary personalities coming into play. These two are going to be pivotal to the story. On the right is Lord Chelmsford, commander of British forces in southern Africa. He's been in the British Army all his life, but he's never made any money, and the family are not as affluent as he would like. Indeed, his sister has seen more combat service than he has, because she was in the siege of Lucknow in 1857. And so he feels that he needs a war to complete his career. He's a man in his mid-50s that clearly feels that he's been overlooked for promotion. Right next to him is Sir Bartle Frere, the governor of the colony, and Sir Bartle Frere is feeling that he's been made, put in charge of a colony that is no longer a pivotal stopover on the route to empire. Both of these people feel that they need a war or some major political event to put themselves back into the public consciousness of the Home Office in London, and the fellow on the left of the photograph is ideal for that purpose. He has an ego to rival Chelmsford's and Ferrer's. His name is Cetshwayo, and he is the king of the Zulu nation, and he reconfigures that Zulu nation, restructures the tribal system, introduces conscription, and puts the nation on a war footing. This worries the British settlers, who are wondering what's happening in that part of the colony that hasn't been absorbed by the British or by the Boers. Is there worthwhile farmland there? Could there be mineral resources that could be exploited? They are not sure, they are curious, and this is a man who is not going to step down. He is ideal for almost blackmail, if you like. Frere and Chelmsford put their heads together and submit to him an ultimatum to disarm his army, to restructure his society, an ultimatum that they know that he's never going to meet. And as a result, that provides them with an excuse to go to war 140 years ago this year. Chelmsford then sets about planning this campaign. He designs three attack columns, one coming in from the northwest, another from the west, and another from the south. And those three columns will converge on the Zulu capital at Ulundi. The third column, largely led by the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 24th Regiment, the Warwickshire Regiment, commanded by Colonel Glynn, will take the main road from the supply depot at Rourke's Drift on the Natal side, the British side of the Buffalo River. They'll cross over into Zululand and follow the only known trafficable road to Ulundi. Their flanks will be covered by the other two assault columns, and a 4th and 5th column are on the Natal side of the border to provide defence in depth. Now, they are largely British units, particularly number 3 column has got 2 battalions of a very fine British regiment with a great deal of African experience, the 24th Regiment of Foot. Most of the others are locally recruited from the European population, many of them mounted soldiers, but the backbone of this Chelmsford's expeditionary force are African natives. 1 man in 5 has a rifle or a musket, the rest are armed with traditional weapons, throwing spears, stabbing spears, clubs, and so on. Most of these are mustered into battalions of the Natal native contingent, and the battalions of the Natal native contingent that are following Glynn's column are commanded by Rupert Latrobe Lonsdale, and there's no guessing or no challenge that he was born in the colony of Victoria, and the most senior commander of the Natal African soldiers is a Victorian, a bit of a ne'er-do-well, and drummed out of the British Army, but finds his leadership qualities coming to the fore in Africa. This is where they cross the river. Where this photograph was taken is British territory in Natal in 1879, in January of 1879, indeed on the 11th of January. The British looked across that drift of the Buffalo River, named after an Irishman named Rourke. The little mission station that was his old homestead is a few hundred metres away from this crossing, and the road crosses here because it's shallow and winds its way into Zululand towards the Zulu capital at Ulundi. This is the road. You can see a contemporary map, and the yellow line is the road, the only road they know of, into Zululand. This is that road today, and on the skyline is the rock at Isandlwana. It gives the place its name. Of course, for the 24th Regiment, they took one look at it, and their regimental badge is the Sphinx. And so they felt that it was a wonderful omen. They crossed the Buffalo River on the 11th of January 1879, and it took them 11 days to get to Isandlwana. The problem was that the place was chaos. If we have a look at the next slide, this is what that road looked like in that second week of January of 1879. There are British regulars in redcoats, there are African levies in African auxiliaries in whatever they can find, and as well as Boer transport contractors and African Africans in charge of the buffalo transport. So it takes Glynn 10 days to cross the river and travel about 12 miles into Zululand, and they camp at the base of Isandlwana. The issue there is that Glynn at the last moment finds his column joined by Lord Chelmsford and his staff. Immediately there is a crisis of command. Who's in charge? The colonel in charge of the 2 battalions of the 24th Regiment and notionally in command of the 3 battalions of African auxiliaries following him, or is it Lord Chelmsford? And this crisis of command dogs the entire expedition. Glynn will make a decision, it'll be countermanded by Chelmsford. Chelmsford will talk to the junior leaders, the battalion commanders, indeed in some cases the company commanders. It's just chaos. So they get as far as Isandlwana at the rock. They set up camp there on the 21st of January. If you look on the right of the photograph, you can see the mountain of Isandlwana, and the road is running over a saddle between that and a knoll to the south of it. They set up the wagons in a line. The 1st Battalion of the 24th stays in camp, and they then start to send out Chelmsford orders patrols to go out and start looking for the Zulus. He uses Lonsdale and his African auxiliaries, and they head south towards those mountains that you can see on the skyline in the Mangeni Valley, and they start to encounter small groups of Zulus. Chelmsford's so keen for battle that he leaves camp with half the force and goes in pursuit. He believes that the army with him, and the backbone of his army, is the 24th Regiment, and that regiment, obviously with 2 battalions, he leaves the 1st Battalion behind. He takes the 2nd Battalion and most of the African troops with him. They're armed with the recently acquired Martini Henry rifle, 5.77 450 caliber, very lethal breech-loading firearm, and he believes that sustained rifle fire from companies of those soldiers, that's 80 soldiers under the command of a captain or a major, will defeat any possible native enemy. The Zulus, on the other hand, have reconfigured their army, and Cetshwayo has revisited some of the philosophies of his grandparents, and he believes that the Zulu army should work using the imagination of the horns of a bull buffalo, if you like, where the bulk of his army will form the chest. They will go forward and engage the enemy, keep the enemy still, while wings, or the horns if you like, a right and a left horn, will fan out and encircle the enemy and then overwhelm them from the flanks and from behind. And he has restructured his weapon systems. He has banned the extensive use of throwing spears and shortened them to thrusting spears and clubs. He wants his soldiers to close to very close range, hand to hand with the enemy. This works very well until he encounters large numbers of enemy with projectile weapons like firearms, and so a major portion of his army, when the horns of the bull buffalo work extremely well against other native enemies, they even work reasonably well against Boer settlers on the trek. But one thing he learns about fighting Boers is that the firearm is a lethal battlefield influence on any battlefield. And so by 1879, probably 20% or more of his own army are carrying firearms. Many of them are muzzle-loading antiquated muskets, but some are reasonably recent. And so the one thing the movie lets us down with, I think, is that imagining that every Zulu only has a thrusting spear. Reality is at least 1 in 5 has got a musket or a breech-loading firearm. And so what's the situation? Chelmsford has divided his force. He's got hints that there are Zulus out there, and he's taken the major portion of his force in pursuit down the road towards a line of hills. On the morning of the 22nd of January 1879, he disappears with the lion's share of the force. He leaves command of the location, vests in a lieutenant colonel named Pauline, who's commanding the 1st Battalion of the 24th. He hasn't told them to dig in. They're there to protect the wagons until Chelmsford calls them forward. Now, this line of wagons extends for over 1 kilometre, and he's only got 6 companies. Pauline only has 6 companies of infantry. So he scatters his soldiers in company groups with gaps of several hundred metres between them, and they advance forward of the wagon lines, in some cases up to 3 kilometres. And so they're fanned out in a widely spaced semicircle. So imagine you've got this huge rock behind you. At the base of the rock is the line of wagons with your foodstuffs and ammunition for your own soldiers and for the column that's gone out searching for Zulus. The men that need that foodstuffs and ammunition, they've moved forward into groups of 80 soldiers, clumped in a crescent. Now at the base of that rock, if you are watching the general and his men disappear to your front right, on your left is a wall, a huge plateau, the Nutu Plateau, and you've got no idea what's beyond that. In front of you are 2 small round hills, and the valley just continues way over the horizon. This is the situation Pauline is focusing on as Chelmsford and his men pull out at first light and go off to the mountains down on the right. He has no idea what's beyond that wall on his left, and he's not really sure what's disappearing in the haze way out to the east, to the end of the valley. A couple of hours after Chelmsford leaves, a colonel named Durnford comes up from the border with mounted African and local European volunteers on horseback. He outranks Pauline. So again, there's a disaster, there's a confusion of command. Who really is making these decisions? While this is going on, messages are coming in from some of the scouts, some of the observation posts that Pauline, a fine soldier, has sent out up onto the cliff and beyond those 2 little hills in the distance. And they're mentioning that they are seeing groups of Zulu warriors. These aren't the Zulus that Chelmsford's gone chasing. So who are they? Is there a risk to the camp? Pauline, Durnford, having this conversation, Durnford says, don't worry, I'm going to go and find out who they are. He takes his mounted soldiers and they ride off down the valley, several kilometres away. They take a plodding group of artillerymen armed with 2 rocket tubes, stumbling along behind them with their rocket tubes on mules. What they don't realise, what's happening on the other side of that hill, is that a Zulu army of almost 24,000 are moving up into the valley beyond that hill. They are commanded by a cousin of Chetwayo's, a fellow named Singwayo, a lifetime of combat experience. He doesn't want to fight on the 22nd. It's a bad omen. Their fighting day should be the 23rd. But he brings up the chest of the buffalo just behind the wall of that plateau, and he starts to deploy the right and the left horn of the buffalo. The left horn goes around behind the 2 little hills way to the east of the camp, and their advance party runs into Durnford and his men on horseback. What Durnford finds as he rides around that little hill with his 200 men on horseback is about 6,500 Zulus coming on at the trot. He wheels around and immediately starts to fall back on the camp, leaving that poor group of artillerymen, about 3 dozen of them, with 2 rocket tubes to set up as quickly as they possibly can. The Zulus come on at the run, and the artillerymen have no chance. They get about 2 rounds away from each tube before they're overwhelmed. And the Zulus have a rather quaint tradition whereby they can't afford to leave the dead behind. They believe that if they kill somebody, the spirit of that person will haunt them unless the spirit is released. And so their thrusting spear is then driven into the lower abdomen, and the corpse of their enemy is opened through to the breastbone. It releases the spirit of the dead. It certainly denies the opportunity to play dead if any of the British soldiers decide that they're going to let the Zulu wave sweep over them. And so the rocket battery die very, very quickly. I don't know how useful it is to point to the map if you're sitting at the back of the room, but what you can see here is that Durnford's people have gone forward beyond 2 small hills. They've discovered the Zulus, and now they're falling back rapidly. Not chaotically. They realise that if they run, then the entire wing of the camp, the entire flank of the camp, will be open. And so they fall back, find protected cover, and they hand over to their horse holders, and they deliver shots from their Martini Henry carbines into the advancing Zulus. They play a pivotal role in delaying the advance of the left wing. But what can a few hundred men armed with carbines do against 6,000? And so they can't hold. They are falling back. Around about this stage, let's see what's on the next slide. So if you can see in this photograph the wall, that plateau out to the left is that ridge on the left-hand side. Those 2 small hills, Amatsuchani in the distance, where Durnford begins his retreat. He stops beyond the trees that are on the right-hand side of this photograph. Those little white cairns mark the graves of clusters of British dead. When the British returned to that battlefield in May of 1879 and they found the bodies of the dead that had been left behind, they raked them into small piles and buried them beneath cairns of stone that they painted white. And that's one of the most atmospheric aspects of this battlefield. You can see how this battalion died. These large, widely spaced cairns a long way from where the wagons lines were, and as you draw back towards that rock, the cairns get smaller and closer together. I cannot imagine what it must have been like for those company commanders commanding their 80 soldiers, widely dispersed. There are no interlocking fields of fire, and they're standing beneath that wall, that extraordinary escarpment, and suddenly the chest of the bull buffalo arrives on the skyline. Nearly 15,000 Zulu warriors suddenly line the skyline. You're looking around at about 1,300 British and native soldiers. Doom must have settled in very, very quickly, but nobody panicked. The evidence of the archaeology of the site suggests that these men fought to the last, and they fought in a disciplined way. They fell back on each other. They tried to support. As each of the companies fell back towards the wagon lines, they were delivering disciplined volleys of Martini Henry fire at those Zulus. The Zulus are suffering massive casualties, but they still come on. Durnford is trying to link up with the companies as they're falling back on the wagon lines. Red indicate the companies of British soldiers. They're completely overwhelmed by Zulus. They can see the bull buffalo up on the plateau. They can see the left horn sweeping around, driving Durnford and his men back, and so they're falling back on their wagon lines. What they don't appreciate is that the right horn of the bull buffalo has swept down from the plateau, down behind the great rock of Isandlwana, and has cut off their line of retreat. There is no way they can fall back along that road to Isandlwana, and so they're completely surrounded. That becomes very apparent within an hour of the contact breaking, and they are suffering enormous casualties. The Zulus are closing in from all sides, and they keep coming on. Here you can see the saddle and the cairns of stones as those last survivors of the companies conglomerate to fall back on each other. By this stage, the Zulus have swept through the wagon park. Pauline is probably dead, and it's now a company commander's war. Sorry. This is where the last coherent stand of the 24th Regiment is made, and at this stage, Pauline realises that they are about to be overwhelmed. He hands the Queen's colour of the regiment to two subalterns within the battalion, Lieutenants Coghill and Melville, and tells them to save the colours. And meanwhile, the rest of the soldiers fall back on each other. The Coghill and Melville mount their horses and ride away. The only European, and indeed most of the native survivors of the Battle of Isandlwana, were horse-mounted. They were able to outride the Zulus on foot, but the infantry are doomed. There's no way that they can outrun the Zulus. And here we've got a scene painted by a British artist named Fripp, who visited the battlefield in the middle of 1879 with some of the informants and some of the post-operational report, and he's trying to recreate the last moments of those companies of British soldiers as they're overwhelmed. And you can see the rock of Isandlwana in the background. One of those groups, about 60 soldiers from what's left of C Company and F Company of the 24th, falls back over the saddle and realises that the road to Rourke's Drift is cut, and so they head south for the Buffalo River. They are still fighting, they're still protecting their mates. This is Coghill and Melville. They see this group of soldiers fighting their way out, protecting, standing back to back, and they attempt to make the Buffalo River, heading south as well. And they grab the Queen's colour and they head for the river. But for the men of the 24th, the infantry, there is no escape. And for the last little groups of survivors, this illustration shows the soldiers, they've run out of ammunition, and the Zulus are throwing corpses of their own dead onto the British bayonets to disarm the British soldiers so that they can close to close range and kill them with their thrusting spears and clubs. And the last survivor, commanding a group of soldiers, seen by the last horse-mounted men to leave the Battle of Isandlwana, was 27-year-old Frederick Edgar Anstey. Anstey was from South Australia and born and raised in Adelaide, and his older brother is serving with the Royal Engineers at this stage. Anstey was one of the last officers to die at Isandlwana, with 60 of his soldiers around him. Anstey, ironically, his brother returned to the battlefield in May of 1879, located where his brother was buried, and dug him up. He was the only body recovered from the battlefield at Isandlwana, and it was sent to Britain. His parents had left Adelaide and returned to their ancestral home in Woking. So Edgar Anstey from Adelaide, one of the last known British officer to die at Isandlwana, is now buried in Woking in Britain. This map, this diagram we've seen before, just indicates the surrounding, the unit has been surrounded. The mounted survivors, if they can get back to the river, they've got a chance, but most of them are headed off and killed. And this is an illustration of the last moments of the lives of Coghill and Melville. They make the river, they cross the river, and they're in the process of climbing a hill on the British side, and the Zulus countering Chetwayo's directions. Over 4,000 of them cross the river, and Melville and Coghill are killed there. The colours are lost. This is that location. It's called Fugitives Drift on the Buffalo River. You can see just how inhospitable the country is. Everything's got prickles on it. The cliffs are precipitous, and and yet this is the terrain that the few survivors from Isandlwana are able to save themselves by crossing the river at this point. Bizarrely, in January of this year, the 140th anniversary of that battle was commemorated by a reenactment. And Michael Caine obviously didn't turn up, but there's this extraordinary scene of Zulus in running shoes attacking pretend British soldiers from the local reenactment group at Talana. And I just thought it was an extraordinary image to end on. How do we remember places like Rourke's Drift, like Isandlwana? An extraordinary book was written about the Battle of Isandlwana, published about 8 years ago by Colonel Mike Snook, who was the former commander of the Royal Regiment of Wales, the descendant of the 24th Regiment that died at Isandlwana. And he quoted Macaulay and Horatius when he introduced the book, and suggested, how can men die better than facing fearful odds for the ashes of their fathers and the temples of their gods? I'm not sure that was Anstey's last thought as he led the 60 survivors to their doom in the saddle at Isandlwana.